happens when Florida's quiet coastlines suddenly become the front line of a global smuggling war? That question shocked America in 2025, when federal agents and local sheriffs uncovered one of the most sophisticated smuggling pipelines ever seen on U.S. soil. In the early hours off Fort Pierce, 3 small boats launched with precision. On board were 30 Chinese nationals, 2 children among them, 5 Bahamian facilitators, and nearly 170 kilograms of cocaine worth millions on the street. What seemed like another calm Florida morning became a battle against transnational cartels. Authorities had been watching closely. The operation started with something ordinary, a group of men renting an Airbnb in Fort Pierce. But beneath the vacation home facade was a command center. Instead of beach towels and theme park plans, laptops and satellite phones were being used to coordinate boats, lookouts, and traffickers. According to investigators, their mission was chillingly clear sail into the Bahamas, pick up drugs and migrants, and bring both into Florida before sunrise. By 5:30 in the morning, their boat sliced through the Atlantic waters. What the smugglers did not know was that Homeland Security, the DEA, and the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office had already locked in on them. 2 vessels were intercepted quickly. A third attempted to break away, proving that this was not a reckless attempt but a carefully rehearsed playbook with contingency routes. The takedown revealed a well-financed network with criminals in China funneling people to the Bahamas and Bahamian smugglers staging launches toward the U.S. The numbers behind the operation tell their own story. Migrants were paying up to $35,000 per head. Cocaine shipments were measured not in small bricks, but in hundreds of pounds. Experts at Jane's Defense Weekly noted that cartels increasingly operate like multinational corporations, layered logistics, compartmentalized teams, and profit margins running into the tens of millions. What shocked many was the use of children on board, a tactic critics described as human shields meant to complicate enforcement responses. Florida's Sheriff Richard Del Toro captured the mood bluntly. "Our county will not be a gateway for criminal enterprises." His words mirrored the Trump administration's messaging, which since 2024 had tightened the southern land border to near impenetrable levels. As a result, smugglers sought the path of least resistance to the sea. U.S. Coast Guard statistics backed this shift. In July 2024, land-based drug seizures tallied over 450 cases. By July 2025, that figure plummeted to barely 30, even as maritime seizures surged past 800 cases halfway through the year. This shift mirrors broader global instability. While Florida battled sea smuggling, Europe was confronting mass arms trafficking linked to the Russia-Ukraine war, and Israel was striking Iranian weapons convoys in Syria. Analysts from DW and Defense News warn that criminal networks often exploit geopolitical conflict zones. For instance, cocaine trafficking routes from South America are now merging with arms smuggling pipelines supplying both Middle Eastern militias and Eastern European battlefronts. The Florida bust, though local in execution, is part of this broader storm. NATO strategists privately admit that America's coastlines are becoming as strategically vulnerable as Europe's eastern borders. If cartels can blend human smuggling with narcotics at Florida's doorstep, what prevents hostile states from testing the same channels for weapons or espionage? A Western intelligence official speaking to Reuters put it starkly. Smuggling networks are not just about drugs, they are about access. Whoever controls the routes controls the risks. The Fort Pierce operation was hailed as a victory, but it also raised urgent questions about the evolving nature of America's borders. Florida, once a tourist magnet, now looks increasingly like a front line, and the larger issue remains unanswered. If cartels can adapt this fast, can the United States and its allies keep pace? Question for viewers. With Florida's coastline now a battlefield against international cartels, do you think America should treat its maritime borders with the same urgency as the southern land border? What if the Florida operation was not an isolated crime, but a carefully engineered blueprint of a smuggling pipeline that stretches halfway across the globe? That is exactly what investigators discovered once they peeled back the layers of the Fort Pierce bust. Far from being a random attempt, this was the visible edge of a multinational supply chain, a system that fused human trafficking, narcotics distribution, and organized crime tactics in one seamless package. At the heart of this blueprint was recruitment. Chinese nationals lured by promises of entry into the United States were charged fees ranging from $30,000 to $35,000 US. Many sold property or emptied life savings to finance the trip. The first leg involved legal flights into the Bahamas, a nation whose relaxed immigration controls in recent years created fertile ground for staging operations. Once in Nassau, recruits were held in safe houses until smugglers judged the seas calm and enforcement light. Florida's law enforcement officials revealed that the smugglers used Airbnb rentals in Fort Pierce not as homes, but as mission headquarters. Here they arranged transport, communicated with offshore handlers, and stationed counter-surveillance teams on beaches. According to Homeland Security reports, these lookouts were tasked with monitoring law enforcement patrols and signaling if interception seemed imminent. It was a tactic drawn directly from organized crime handbooks, a blending of legitimate consumer services with illicit objectives. The system also relied on redundancy. 3 boats launched simultaneously, knowing at least one could break away if pursued. This kind of tiered planning resembled military doctrine more than casual smuggling. Analysts at Defense News noted that similar contingency methods are used by naval forces during blockade running, underscoring the cartel's increasing professionalism. One Bahamian facilitator caught during the raid admitted to law enforcement that backup vessels were always on call in case of mechanical failure or capture. The cocaine shipment embedded within the operation added another layer of complexity. By pairing narcotics with migrants, smugglers diversified risk and profit. Even if one payload failed, another might succeed. Experts at The Guardian reported that global cartels increasingly bundle their trades, mixing fentanyl precursors, cocaine, and human cargo across the same routes. It is an insurance model that maximizes revenue while straining enforcement resources. Internationally, this pipeline ties into a much larger pattern. In 2025, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime warned that global criminal revenues from human trafficking and narcotics surpassed $200 billion annually, rivaling the GDP of mid-sized nations. These funds often intersect with geopolitical conflicts. Weapons smuggled into Ukraine, for example, are sometimes financed with proceeds from narcotics operations. In the Middle East, Israeli intelligence has intercepted Iranian-backed groups using smuggling profits to acquire drones and missiles. Florida's bust is therefore not only about migrants and cocaine, it connects directly to the financial bloodstream of global instability. Western experts are blunt in their assessment. A former NATO counter-narcotics advisor told BBC News, "If you think this is just about a few boats in Florida, you are missing the scale. These networks are adaptive organisms. They shift routes as easily as water flows downhill." His warning underlines the challenge for US strategy. Shutting one corridor often means another will open. President Trump's administration has emphasized that maritime enforcement must mirror the toughness of land border policies. Coast Guard assets have been surged in both Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. Yet critics note that America's coastline stretches more than 90,000 kilometers, if territories are included, making total coverage impossible. Technology, including drones, satellites, and AI-driven maritime tracking, is increasingly seen as the only way to outpace smuggling pipelines that operate on global, not local scales. The blueprint uncovered in Fort Pierce is thus both a tactical success and a strategic warning. America's adversaries, be they cartels or state actors, are studying these vulnerabilities. And as this case shows, they are not afraid to innovate, to exploit Airbnb apps and commercial flights as easily as they exploit porous beaches. Question for viewers: if cartels are now running their operations like military campaigns, should America treat these smuggling pipelines as a matter of national security rather than just criminal law enforcement? How do you stop criminals who treat the ocean like their battlefield and law enforcement like their chess opponents? The Fort Pierce case revealed not only the brutality of the smuggling pipeline, but also the extraordinary coordination of America's law enforcement response. What unfolded in those early morning hours was a tactical showdown between professional smugglers and an interagency force determined to send a message. The game began long before the boats launched. Intelligence sharing proved decisive. Homeland Security investigations had tipped off the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office after detecting suspicious rental patterns. DEA agents traced links to cocaine shipments originating in Colombia and funneled through Caribbean hubs. Customs and Border Protection coordinated with the Coast Guard to monitor vessel movements across the Florida Straits. This web of communication meant that when the smugglers made their move, multiple agencies were already in position. At 5:30 in the morning, 3 boats emerged from Fort Pierce Inlet. Marine units from the sheriff's office shadowed them silently while federal teams coordinated interception points. 2 boats were cornered swiftly, but the third executed a sudden breakaway, pushing into open waters. This maneuver highlighted the smugglers' military-style planning, always keeping a diversionary option, but it also triggered an equally professional counter. Coast Guard fast response cutters surged into pursuit, using radar and drone surveillance to maintain contact until backup backup intercepted the fleeing craft. Sheriff Richard Del Toro emphasized the symbolism afterward. This was law enforcement at its best. Local deputies, federal partners, and state agencies shoulder to shoulder blocking a foreign cartel from using our coastline. The success was not just about seizing 30 migrants and 170 kilograms of cocaine, it was about proving that interagency cooperation could match the sophistication of transnational crime. Western security experts point out that the coordination mirrors NATO military doctrine. Just as Allied forces train for interoperability against adversaries, American agencies must integrate seamlessly against criminal networks. A former Coast Guard admiral speaking to Reuters explained smugglers operate without borders. If our agencies act in silos, we lose. Florida showed the opposite layers of surveillance, marine units, air support, and ground arrests all meshed into one operation. The Florida takedown also carried a psychological element. Cartels thrive on the perception that they are untouchable. By intercepting all 3 vessels, including the one that attempted to flee US agencies, disrupted not only the operation, but also the myth of invincibility. This is crucial, analysts at DW argue, because cartels recruit heavily on reputation. Demonstrating vulnerability weakens their ability to attract both financiers and foot soldiers. Still, challenges remain. For every successful interdiction, experts estimate that multiple other shipments succeed undetected. The sheer scale of maritime territory, thousands of miles of coastline, countless inlets, and private docks creates blind spots. Technology is narrowing that gap. Defense News reports that new unmanned surface drones equipped with infrared and radar sensors are being tested to patrol Florida waters. These innovations aim to provide constant coverage at a fraction of the manpower cost. Globally, the law enforcement chess match is echoed elsewhere. In the Black Sea, NATO navies are monitoring Russian attempts to mask illicit cargoes amid the Ukraine war. In the Persian Gulf, US destroyers interdict Iranian smuggling dhows carrying drone parts bound for militias. Florida's bust fits into this larger mosaic where law enforcement increasingly resembles military readiness against adversaries who refuse to play by traditional rules. President Trump's administration has signaled that such interagency fusion operations will be expanded. Task forces combining DEA, FBI, ICE, and state sheriffs are slated to receive more funding, with Trump declaring Florida's coast a border that must be defended with the same urgency as Texas. Whether this momentum can be sustained against networks with billions in profits remains to be tested. The chess match continues with every move by US agencies answered by countermoves from cartels. The key question is not whether America can win one battle, but whether it can sustain victory in a war of adaptation. Question for viewers: if smugglers constantly adapt with new tactics, should the US increase investment in AI-driven surveillance and autonomous patrols to stay one step ahead? What price is paid when human lives are reduced to cargo bundled with cocaine and trafficked across seas as though they were commodities? The Fort Pierce operation underscored the brutal human cost and the criminal economics driving such pipelines. Behind the dramatic chase and drug seizures were people, men, women, and even children treated as expendable pieces in a billion-dollar criminal industry. The Chinese nationals on board the boats had been promised a new beginning in America. Instead, they were packed onto vessels alongside 370 pounds of cocaine. 2 children were among them, a fact that chilled even seasoned investigators. Authorities believe the children were used not because families sought refuge, but as leverage human shields designed to complicate the decision-making of enforcement teams. The message from traffickers was cruelly simple: law enforcement would hesitate if children were present. Financial incentives explain the ruthlessness. According to US intelligence reports, smuggling networks were charging up to $35,000 per migrant. For a single boatload of 30 individuals, the revenue approached $1 million before factoring in the street value of the cocaine. Western analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly observed that such figures rival the profits of mid-tier defense contractors, highlighting just how lucrative the business model of cartels has become. Migrants often mortgage their futures to fund the journey. Families in rural China have been documented selling farmland, liquidating assets, or borrowing from loan sharks to cover the cost. Once captured and deported, they return not only empty-handed but indebted, often facing social stigma and financial ruin. The tragedy deepens when children are involved, some separated from parents during detention, others scarred by the trauma of near drowning or law enforcement chases. Smugglers, meanwhile, operate with chilling detachment. As experts from The Guardian note, cartels increasingly treat human smuggling and narcotics trafficking as two sides of the same coin. If one cargo is lost, another pays out. Diversification insulates profits. One DEA officer summarized it starkly. For cartels, a migrant is worth $30,000. A kilo of cocaine is worth tens of thousands more. Either way, they profit. The risk is borne entirely by the human beings they exploit. The economics also intersect with global conflicts. In Eastern Europe, Russia's war against Ukraine has disrupted traditional smuggling channels, forcing traffickers to seek new maritime corridors. In the Middle East, Iran-backed groups have reportedly relied on narcotics revenues to finance drone and missile programs targeting Israel. Al Jazeera recently reported that Hezbollah's drug routes through Latin America now generate billions annually, much of it funneled back into weapon stockpiles. Florida's cocaine seizures therefore cannot be seen in isolation. They are nodes in a global network where drugs, migrants, and weapons feed into each other. Florida officials stress that beyond the numbers lies a moral imperative. Sheriff Richard Del Toro condemned the smugglers for reducing children to bargaining chips. Human rights groups echoed this outrage, warning that such tactics blur the line between organized crime and war crimes. When children are used as shields in conflicts, the world reacts with horror. The same, they argue, should apply to criminal networks weaponizing innocence for profit. President Trump's administration has promised harsher penalties for those convicted of child endangerment in smuggling cases, including expanded federal charges and mandatory minimum sentences. Critics argue that tougher sentencing alone cannot break the cycle unless combined with international cooperation to dismantle the financial networks underpinning the trade. The question remains haunting when human desperation collides with cartel greed. Who truly pays the price? For the 30 individuals on those boats, the answer is clear. They gambled everything only to be betrayed by a system designed to profit from their hope. Question for viewers: should global smuggling networks that use children as shields be prosecuted under international humanitarian law the same way war crimes are? Why are smugglers increasingly turning the ocean into their highway? The answer lies in the tightening of land borders and the shifting balance of global migration routes. The Florida bust revealed not just a single criminal scheme, but a wider trend. Sea corridors are rapidly becoming the preferred pathways for human and drug smuggling alike. Under President Trump, southern land border enforcement has reached unprecedented levels. New surveillance systems, physical barriers, and cooperative agreements with Mexico have drastically reduced illegal crossings by land. The numbers speak for themselves. U.S. authorities recorded more than 450 land-based drug seizures in July 2024. But by July 2025, that figure had collapsed to just over 30. Smugglers forced to adapt redirected their efforts toward the sea, where enforcement remains more complex. Florida is now bearing the brunt of this shift. With its vast coastline dotted with private docks, hidden inlets, and bustling marinas, it offers thousands of potential entry points. The Bahamas, only a short sail away, has become a staging ground. Its more relaxed immigration policies provide cover for traffickers to gather recruits and prepare shipments. A former Coast Guard commander told BBC News for Cartels, geography is opportunity. The Florida Straits are close, porous, and difficult to patrol in their entirety. This maritime pivot mirrors global patterns. In Europe, traffickers exploit the Mediterranean, sending migrants from Libya and Turkey into southern Europe despite EU patrols. In Asia, criminal networks ferry narcotics across the South China Sea, often shadowing commercial shipping lanes to mask their routes. Analysts at DW note that as land borders harden, worldwide oceans increasingly serve as the new smuggling frontier. Technology, however, is beginning to shift the balance back toward law enforcement. Drones equipped with infrared sensors now patrol Florida's waters. Satellite imagery helps detect unusual vessel concentrations near Bahamian shores. Defense News recently reported that the Pentagon is testing AI-driven predictive models capable of identifying smuggling hotspots before boats even launch. These tools, when combined with traditional Coast Guard patrols, offer hope of containing the surge. The strategic stakes extend far beyond Florida. If cartels can exploit maritime routes with such efficiency, hostile states could potentially piggyback on the same corridors. Western experts warn that smuggling pipelines could one day carry more than migrants and narcotics. They could be used to deliver weapons, sabotage tools, or even operatives. In the current climate of heightened US-China tensions, this possibility cannot be ignored. Al Jazeera highlighted fears that criminal networks, if left unchecked, might serve as unwitting couriers for state actors seeking covert entry points. For NATO, this maritime trend reinforces a sobering truth: borders are no longer confined to land. The same alliances that guard Europe's eastern flank from Russian aggression must adapt to support maritime security in the Atlantic and Caribbean. British naval officers have already joined US counterparts in joint patrols near the Bahamas, signaling that America's allies see this as part of a collective security challenge. Critics, however, question whether the US and NATO can sustain such commitments while also juggling crises in Ukraine and the Middle East. With Russian missile attacks intensifying and Israel-Iran tensions threatening to ignite the wider region, resources are stretched thin. Florida's operation demonstrates both the necessity and the strain of multi-front defense. The question remains urgent as land routes close and sea routes surge. Can the United States and its allies truly defend every waterway, or are smugglers simply proving that no border, whether on land or sea, can ever be fully sealed? Question for viewers. With smugglers pivoting to oceans worldwide, should NATO expand its role into anti-smuggling operations in the Atlantic and Caribbean, treating them as seriously as threats in Ukraine or the Middle East? What does Florida's smuggling crackdown really reveal about America's future security beyond the dramatic chase and the cocaine-laden boats? The Fort Pierce operation raised questions that stretch from local docks to the White House Situation Room. The message was clear. Florida is no longer just a tourist haven, it is a border, a front line in the fight against transnational crime. Sheriff Richard Del Toro captured this reality when he declared, "We do have a border here in Florida. It's our coastline." That statement resonated nationally because it redefined how Americans think of borders. For decades, political debates centered on fences, walls, and checkpoints in Texas and Arizona. But in 2025, under President Trump, enforcement at the southern border became so effective that smugglers recalibrated. The ocean became their alternative highway, and Florida their new target. This shift has strategic consequences. The U.S. Coast Guard and Customs and Border Protection are now stretched across thousands of miles of coastline. NATO allies are quietly acknowledging that America's maritime vulnerabilities could ripple into their own security. British officials told Reuters that if Florida's pipelines remain unchecked, similar tactics could threaten Europe's shores through Atlantic smuggling corridors. At the geopolitical level, the Florida case intersects with broader threats. Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine has fueled a surge in weapons trafficking, some of which overlaps with narcotics routes. Israeli intelligence warns that Iran-backed groups in the Middle East are blending drug revenues with drone warfare investments. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly argue that criminal and geopolitical pipelines are increasingly indistinguishable, with profits from narcotics financing both cartels and militant groups. America's coastline, therefore, is not only an entry point for cocaine, it is a potential channel for weapons and destabilization. Technology remains both a challenge and a solution. Smugglers have embraced commercial apps, charter rentals, and encrypted communications. Law enforcement is countering with drones, AI-driven surveillance, and enhanced satellite tracking. Defense News reported that U.S. agencies are testing unmanned surface vehicles capable of persistent patrols in Florida waters. Such innovations may be the only way to keep pace with adaptive adversaries. Western experts stress the importance of perception. A retired NATO strategist told DW, each successful interception is more than just an arrest. It's a message to cartels, to migrants, and to hostile states that America will defend every inch of its territory. Yet the same experts caution that one victory cannot disguise the scale of the challenge. Cartels are multinational actors with billions in resources. They adapt quickly, just as Russia has shifted its hybrid warfare tactics in Ukraine, or Iran has shifted proxy operations across the Middle East. President Trump's administration has framed the Fort Pierce bust as proof of America's determination. Coast Guard warnings now emphasize zero tolerance. Any attempt to enter illegally by sea will end in interception and deportation. Still, the underlying reality remains: for every operation stopped, others are being planned. And the true masterminds, the financiers, coordinators, and cartel bosses often remain untouched, hidden behind layers of intermediaries. For Americans, the question now is whether these pipelines are treated as purely criminal enterprises or as national security threats demanding strategic response. If treated as the latter, expect larger budgets, deeper NATO cooperation, and a fusion of military and law enforcement capabilities. If treated as the former, Florida's victory risks becoming just a temporary disruption in a far bigger game. Question for viewers: should America elevate smuggling pipelines to the level of national security threats, placing them alongside terrorism and cyber warfare in priority, or keep them under traditional law enforcement? The Fort Pierce operation in 2025 was more than a police raid. It exposed a sophisticated global pipeline linking Chinese migrants, Bahamian facilitators, and cocaine traffickers into Florida's coastline. Across 6 sections, the narrative traced the operations unfolding from Airbnb rentals turned into command hubs to backup boats racing across the Atlantic to the human cost of children used as shields. It showed how smugglers now operate like multinational corporations, diversifying profits across narcotics and human cargo, and how they adapt when land borders harden by shifting to the sea. The crackdown demonstrated the power of interagency cooperation, but also revealed the daunting scale of maritime vulnerability. Experts warn that Florida's coastline is no longer just a state boundary, but a strategic border with global implications potentially exploited not only by cartels, but by hostile states. Under President Trump, America has tightened land controls, expanded Coast Guard assets, and embraced new technologies. Yet the larger war remains uncertain. Cartels adapt quickly, profits soar, and global conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East intersect with smuggling pipelines in ways that blur the line between crime and geopolitics. The lesson is stark borders are no longer lines on maps. They are fluid, adaptive, and contested. Florida's bust sent a message, but the real battle will be whether America and its allies can sustain this defense in the face of global criminal innovation. Final question for viewers. If Florida has become America's new front line, should NATO and the US treat smuggling pipelines with the same urgency as wars in Ukraine and the Middle East?